Good morning. Government cover-ups, political smear campaigns, undermining elections, suppressing journalists, rampant business fraud, non-consensual pornography. The problems of misinformation, disinformation, and deep fakes are significant. And right now, digital information is flowing at an astounding velocity with a pandemic of misinformation and confusion about how to discern fact from fraud and truth from a lie. Just this morning, the New York Times reported on yesterday's FBI warning that deepfakes are a significant problem and we should expect an uptick in that sort of activity in the very near future, and that it's being used by nation states to undermine our country, our democracy. And this is an issue that we talked about actually at NYU last March, 2020, just before the whole world changed and we all went to working from home for those 2 weeks that seem to have never ended. But during that time, there have been a lot of significant developments. One, the problem has continued to get worse and more serious. Two, the problem has been more recognized, but there remain questions about what to do with it. Three, there have been developing technologies and standards and coalitions, which we'll talk about, and groups of working together to address this problem. And there's also been new legislation to also address the growing problem of misinformation, disinformation, and deepfakes. That said, we are still left with a serious issue today of what is it? How bad is it? What can we do about it to protect ourselves personally, to protect our government, to protect our business? My name is Judith Germano. I'm a distinguished fellow at NYU's Center for Cybersecurity and a professor in the Masters in Cybersecurity Risk and Strategy program at NYU and an adjunct professor at NYU School of Law. I am here with a wonderful panel of experts. Personally, I come to this issue initially as a former federal prosecutor. When I was litigating cases and investigating cases, it was well established that having two witnesses report on what happened was very good. Having photographic evidence, even better. And if you had a video recording, well, bring that to the jury, and that shows the story of what really happened. But not anymore. It's really changed, and it requires an interdisciplinary approach, which we have here today, of journalists, lawyers, technical experts, policy experts, to look at the different ways that we together can collaborate to address the weaponization of deepfakes and synthetic media, because it has a very real, very significant impact on politics, democracy, business, cybersecurity, and each one of us and our families. A little housekeeping. Many of you sent questions in advance, or some of you did. Thank you. And we will try to address those during the panel. Some of them are integrated already into our discussion. Also, you are welcome to put questions into the Q&A button that you have, and we will address those also during the course of our panel. And for those of you lawyers seeking CLE credit, during our talk today on two different instances, Elizabeth Watcott from our Center for Cybersecurity will come in and speak, give you those secret codes that you will need to put into your form. I want to thank our sponsors, William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, and a huge thank you to Sarvanas Bakhtiar, the Director of Operations at the Center for Cybersecurity, and Elizabeth Watcott, our program assistant. They've been instrumental in all the behind the scenes magic that is required. So without further ado, I will introduce our fabulous experts today. We have Kate Brannon, who's the editorial director of Just Security and a specialist in national security issues. So Kate comes to us with a journalist's perspective and a deep knowledge on national security concerns. Sharif Hanna is the Vice President of Research and Development at TruePic Inc. Ashish Jaman is the Director of Technology and Operations and Customer Security and Trust at Microsoft. Claire Leibowitz is the AI and Media Integrity Program Lead for Partnership on AI. And Michaela McMurrow is a partner at the law firm Covington & Burling. We also have Andy Parsons, who is the Director of Adobe Content Authenticity Initiative. So I thank you, our wonderful panelists, and that's your sort of initial introduction, but really what I'd like to do is start by asking each one of you to tell us how you come to these issues from your important work and your perspective. So Kate, I'll start with you.
Okay, hi everyone. So as Judy said, I'm a journalist, not a lawyer by background. And so the way I think about these issues, I think first and foremost, journalists think of themselves when it comes to disinformation as gatekeepers. Sort of how should I cover these issues? How should I cover disinformation? How can I do it responsibly without amplifying it? But I think that's just sort of a sliver of the way that journalists have to think about it. And we'll talk about this later, sort of how disinformation comes at journalists in different ways. It includes harassment, includes efforts to silence them, it includes, having your identity stolen. And so I think, as a journalist, I sort of track these issues just as a personal responsibility in my role covering these things. And then as an editor at Just Security, we sort of, on a weekly basis are publishing material, legal analysis, policy analysis, whether it's for the Pentagon or the intelligence community, about how deepfakes and disinformation will sort of affect the operating environment in the future.
Sharif, if you can introduce yourself, please.
Sure. Thank you, Judy, and thanks everyone for attending. So my name is Sharif. I'm part of the team at Trupic. We work on secure camera technology. Our whole thesis here is that given the kind of the challenge of figuring out, what to trust, what not to trust, trying to establish objective facts about things that happen in the real world, our approach is to really try to prove what's real from the point of inception. So we have a viewpoint that perhaps there is a way that when it comes to photos and to videos, we can establish the what, when, and where of the creation and how they came to be, as a way to then provide trustworthy and transparent information to viewers who may be looking at them in the future, so that it's another signal for people that they can rely on to evaluate whether or not they trust something, and at least give them this transparent information. So we come at it from the perspective of technology solutions that are not a silver bullet by any stretch of the imagination, but that can act as an aid to people ultimately making the decision about what to trust.
And Claire, if you could please introduce yourself.
Thanks, Judy. My name is Claire Leibowitz, and as Judy said, I lead the AI and Media Integrity program at an organization called the Partnership on Artificial Intelligence, or PAI, which is a global multi-stakeholder nonprofit devoted to responsible AI development and deployment, so a very broad mandate. And I've been at PAI since the organization's inception about 3 years ago. And just for some context, we were founded by the heads of AI research at some of the largest technology companies, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, DeepMind, IBM, Google, and Microsoft, to really attend not only amongst themselves, but with over 100 partners. I'll shout out to Andy and Ashish. Adobe and Microsoft are partners, but over 100 institutions from civil society, academia, journalism, and other prongs of industry to think about how AI technology can be developed with positive societal impact. So it really takes the multidisciplinary spirit of this panel, and I think even more institutions. Personally, I come to this work actually from also multidisciplinary research background in cognitive science and computer science, anchored on an interest in a big question, which is how do we perceive things to be true, authentic, and real in an era where that's under threat, both information and experiences. And at PAI, the portfolio I run is predicated on the question of how do you have high quality public discourse in the AI age? So we focus on synthetic and manipulated content, AI generated content, which we'll discuss, the user component, how people come into contact with that content, and ultimately how AI can better serve the world in terms of promoting credible and not misinforming content.
And Ashish, if you would please introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Judy, and esteemed panelists who I know for quite some time for working in this issue area. So I'm Ashish Jaman. I am part of Microsoft Customer Security and Trust Organization, focusing on Defending Democracy program. Our program sits on 3 pillars: campaign security, election integrity, and disinformation defense. So for this part of disinformation defense, I've been actually focusing on deepfakes, synthetic media, and trying to learn what this issue area is all about, and then trying to figure out what are the meaningful multi-stakeholder, multimodal solution will look like. So when we look at this issue area of deepfake, synthetic media, uh, and the taxonomy is confusing, and I hope we can clarify some of that taxonomy in today's session as well. Is when we look into this issue, we look through a lens of technology. What can technology do to not only enable creators to create meaningful solutions to innovate, but also what technology can do to mitigate or intervene into the malicious use of synthetic media deepfakes. We also look from a policy perspective. How can we inform both internal policy as well as external policy and policymakers about this issue area, for them to be a bit more knowledgeable and responsive. And then we also look at this from a media literacy perspective. Can we provide the right kind of guidance to raise awareness with the activities so that consumers and voters, because I'm part of Defending Democracy program, can be more knowledgeable and become more concerned citizen and critical consumers of information.
And some of you may know Michaela from our Women Leaders in Cybersecurity series, as she's been a speaker and a moderator, and I'm happy to meet Claire and Kate through this, which then you can be part of our programming as well there. But Michaela, if you could introduce yourself as to this issue, would be great.
Sure. Thank you, Judy, and to all of my panelists and everyone today. Thanks for having me. As Judy said, my name is Michaela McMurrow. I'm a partner at Covington & Burling in the New York office. I am a commercial litigator, but I'm also a member of the firm's cybersecurity and data privacy practice group. So in that capacity, I help clients work through issues related to cybersecurity incident response, and also just general policy and advisory work related to cybersecurity. So I come to this issue really with my litigator's hat on, but then also with the hat on in terms of cybersecurity and business risk and corporate risk. As Judy knows, though, I wear a third hat sometimes. Prior to law school, I spent 6 years as a military intelligence officer. And so in my background, I have national security and intelligence training. And I think that when I think about this issue, that experience comes into play as well. So I look forward to discussing these issues today.
Thanks. And last but not least, Andy, welcome. And if you can give your intro, please.
Thanks, Judy, and thanks everybody for being here. I see we have quite a large crowd, which is really encouraging to see as interest grows in this area. So I'm Andy Parsons. I run the Content Authenticity Initiative at Adobe. Work with some of the panelists on that quite actively. The Content Authenticity Initiative was started a couple of years ago based on Adobe's interest in trying to figure out where Adobe and things like provenance, which we'll talk about quite a bit today, fit in the creative ecosystem. So our interest in this space started around ensuring that creative professionals could use very sophisticated, increasingly sophisticated AI-based tools in their work. And in creative professionals, I would include journalists of all kinds, photojournalists, video journalists, and particularly in this context, making sure that the good guys, if you will, could use these very sophisticated technologies in a responsible way. And our answer to how to use them responsibly is, as Sharif said, to find provable facts that can be expressed to consumers, to fact checkers, to human rights defenders, rather than focusing on kind of post hoc detection of what has been falsified. So we have doubled down on the approach. We're working together with a number of folks here in the room and others to build standards in a new organization under the Linux Foundation, but also to deploy these technologies in the field through Adobe tools and many prototypes that we're proud to talk about and share today. And the idea is to make sure that this is not just a hand-waving exercise around writing white papers and solving the problem, but given the urgency that we all face along all the facets that Judy described in her intro, that we show that these are pragmatic, applicable, and that these standards can be adopted in the near term. So that's been our focus. Before I joined Adobe, my career has been mostly around creative professionals, creating tools, helping them gain better livelihoods and do more work more quickly and efficiently with computers. And that has led to the onslaught of AI tools that help folks do those things. And again, in the interest of making sure those things can be used responsibly, I found myself here at Adobe focusing on this.
Thank you. So I'd like to start by just talking about the issues a little bit to make sure, since there are so many different angles we could approach this problem. Claire, if I can start with you in terms of framing from concepts of democracy, elections, public health. I know that's a super loaded question, but just as a starting point, we'll go there.
Sure, and it's not super loaded. I actually just came from a panel where someone said that the most common use case we've seen for manipulated media is around elections and COVID-19 are kind of the case studies we think about. So I first want to underscore in our framing in this conversation around disinformation and deepfakes are one mechanism for disinforming. When we think about disinformation, that could be an inaccurate text that someone sends to a friend. That could also be an AI generated video that is malicious and trying to misinform. So that's one element. Deepfakes aren't the only way to visually misinform. Also, another element, which I think we'll talk about later, but I think it's worth emphasizing at the top, deepfakes aren't inherently malicious. We'll talk about the malicious use cases now, but they can use, as Andy said, for expressive purposes. We've seen lots of satirical deepfakes, and I actually work with a lot of AI artists who generate artistic pieces from this technology. So that's just something to emphasize. In the political domain, deepfakes are still rare. So we have this FBI warning, so maybe that will change in the coming weeks, but I'd say deepfakes are rare. However, media manipulations are quite frequent. I'll use the recent US election as an example. We didn't see a deepfake Joe Biden saying that the election was going to be pushed back several months, which might manipulate how people choose to show up to the polls or not. We did, though, see Donald Trump share a video of Joe Biden bopping his head to Despacito at a campaign event that was actually superimposed with the song Obscenity F the Police to imply Joe Biden was looking to defund the police and tap into political sentiment in that direction. So this is an example of a real video in which it's recontextualized, it's remixed, there's no AI, but it could wreak havoc on how people perceive Joe Biden and manipulate democratic discourse and processes, which of course was the focal point of concern for a lot of the technology platforms that I work with very closely. Something else to name though, we have seen some deepfake or deepfake adjacent use cases for advocacy and satire, again, around the election, more so than for antagonism or malicious use cases. And there has been a push towards fake faces, so not the quite, videos that we might be thinking about, but there's a website called This Person Does Not Exist, and fake faces have been used for political manipulation of discourse. So kind of that's the rare deepfake realm. And in the vaccine misinfo space, there aren't a ton, again, deepfakes that we've seen, more of this kind of visual misinformation that might be misleading because of some component of the artifact or text around it that misleads or misinforms.
A lot of stuff to dig in there, and we will explore the balance between not suppressing art or satire and not becoming too heavy-handed in censorship versus also helping the public become more savvy and better understand what they are looking at. But before we dig into all of that, I still want to talk kind of a little bit high level. Kate, if you can just help us continue to frame this issue from perspective of journalism, harassment, and national security.
Sure. So a lot of what Claire just described, it's sort of a journalist's role to then be the conduit between that activity and the public. How do you cover disinformation, whether it's about the election or the pandemic? How do you do it responsibly? How do you do it without amplifying it? So that's a lot of what the conversation in journalism tends to focus on, is this role as the gatekeeper, as, being sufficiently skeptical, just as the public has to be, about what you're seeing, and then how to responsibly report it. But there's another aspect to it that I think is a little less even understood by the journalist community, the ways that deepfakes and disinformation will come to play in your work. And this gets at the harassment issue. And I'll just share two different stories, sort of true stories, that highlight sort of what journalists are up against already and probably will be even more so going forward. One is the story of Rana Ayub, who's a female journalist in India, and she was reporting on the cover up and the protection of a child rape in India. And she started having tweets come from what looked like her account, saying things like, "I hate India." And she noticed that at first. And then essentially what happened was a deep fake porn was made about her and spread widely. And she wrote about it for the Huffington Post recently. And it caused her in the end to really self-censor herself. It was deeply troubling. It was so sort of shocking. It sent her to the hospital. And so she wrote about what this was like and what it did to her and the impact. And as this panel definitely knows, deepfake porn is like one of the, sort of the most widely used version of this technology right now. And it's used to harass women particularly. And then another story sort of that shows how it can be used, not deep fakes, but disinformation and stolen identity. I have a friend, a reporter who covers the Pentagon, Joe Gould, and he had a story go out after, between the election and inauguration, about the new defense secretary, Secretary Austin, and sort of these wild headlines that he wanted to defund the Army, sort of pulling from the defund police campaign, and was looking to China for the US, to defend America. And it went out under Joe's byline with, a photo of Joe, and it looked like it came from Defense News, and it spread, it was a viral fake news story. And he wrote about what that was like and how he became aware of it and how he pushed back against it. He received questions from the Pentagon about it. And so I think that going forward, journalists have to be aware of the full gamut of how this is going to sort of interplay with their work. And then just to quickly cover some of the implications in the national security realm, it's similar sort of to how the public, but on a much sort of bigger scale with higher stakes. So can be used for blackmail, obviously, blackmailing military officers, a fake audio out of a high stakes meeting with a foreign official, could change, until it's pushed back against, could really change the battlefield. In Joe's case, he saw that a high-level retired general officer had shared this fake story on Telegram. And so Joe reached out to him and said, "I saw you shared this fake news story on Telegram." And the retired general said, "I'm not on any social media. That's a fake account." So military officers can be faked online. And then in the intelligence world, there's a push toward online recruitment instead of, talking to people, interacting in person, especially because biometric technology has sort of proliferated. So it's harder to be a spy out there in the world and keep your identity hidden. And so there's a lot more online recruitment, but then who do you trust online? Are they who they say they are? All that comes into play. I'll leave it there.
And Michaela, in your opening again, so many places to go with that, and we will come back and drill down more on that. But Michaela, you mentioned in your opening about business implications and how you think of this from a corporate responsibility approach. If you could please just speak a little more to that, and then also as we are doing virtual court hearings and other things, there is news in Michigan this week that there was a domestic assault type of case where the witness appeared very nervous, and it turned out that the defendant was in the same house with her, notwithstanding an order of protection, and the court had ordered him to go outside and show his location and where he was, but the prosecutor called it out. And I think that sort of underscores this is a very real issue as we continue to do work remotely, but even going forward in future years, we're international. How do we know it is who we're talking to?
Sure. And I'll start with your first question about businesses and risk, corporate risk. We've heard about sort of the national security threats, the election threats, but not all threats from deepfake really are, in the national security interest. You can have basic crime fraud threat from deepfakes. And in fact, we've already seen this. So we've seen the use of deepfake voice audio to facilitate business email compromise. So business email compromise is a kind of fraud where somebody makes an instruction to somebody at a company to make a payment, typically to pay an invoice, and it's paid to the wrong account. So it's either false payment instructions or it's an entirely false invoice that's paid basically to a criminal actor. And unfortunately, these were common in the past. They are extremely common in the remote environment because some of those inherent sort of controls that are in place when you are in an office and can check in with somebody, hey, I got your email about sending this invoice, do you want me to do that today? Those interactions are not possible in the remote environment. And so we're relying more on electronic media. And what we have already seen is that cyber threat actors have used deepfake voice technology to facilitate business email compromise schemes. So instead of it just being a phishing email, an email purporting to be from a CFO or a CEO, we see false voice messages saying basically it's me and I want you to pay this right away. And so, not every deepfake threat is at the national or the international level. Some of these can just be basic crime fraud and can happen very broadly and at not a lot of expense. I think, we have some technologists on the panel who can speak to it, but, I've read reports that it only takes a few seconds of a person's voice recording to be able to create, a fairly realistic voice deepfake. And so you can imagine what the implications are for folks like CEOs and CFOs whose voices are regularly heard on earnings calls or appearances on television. And so there's a lot of potential for impersonation of those folks. So I think, the corporate risk can go to everything from enhancing what's already, existing cyber fraud to potentially market moving information. You can imagine what might happen if there is a deepfake audio that gets released and purports to be, a fake, leaked internal meeting, right? Where it's like, oh, this is a leaked tape of an internal meeting, and it could be entirely fabricated. But until the markets realize that, right, you may have some reaction in the marketplace. So there can be real world impacts that you have to think about. In terms of the questions surrounding the justice system and the courts, I think that there are a host of issues here, and I think we are really on the front end of it. I think of, when you think about court and going to court, I think really there are two primary ways that this issue can come up. Number one, the deepfake can be the subject of the underlying dispute. So for example, if a deepfake is used as part of a business email compromise and there is a civil action that results from that, the question of the deepfake and how it happened could be central to the underlying dispute. But then there are also basic evidentiary questions about deepfakes that can be related to disputes that have nothing to do, with the technology. So it can be a breach of contract dispute or a securities dispute, and the question can be about the evidence itself, right? The evidence that's coming in, whether it's videotape deposition or other media, audio, as you've noted, audio, video, photographs that are coming in as evidence. And we live in a world where we have rules of evidence and procedure that were developed and designed in a brick and mortar context. And the question is how and when and why should we update those to reflect the new world that we live in? And the last point I think I would make is that, we've all in the last year seen a movement toward remote hearings. So for those, lawyers and litigators on the call, you've probably taken a remote deposition. You've probably done a remote court conference. Maybe some of you have had a remote trial. And it's very interesting, I think the rules of evidence start from a place where they very much put a premium on live testimony. And I think as technology has changed, and certainly in the remote environment, we've taken, a few steps back from that, where we will accept, evidence being submitted on video or on Zoom. And, one question I have is what impact will this technology have on that step back from the live courtroom experience? Will the pendulum swing the other way, and will we go back to preferring, having a live person in front of the judge or the jury in order to decide these cases. So lots of interesting issues to talk about.
Great. Thank you. So Andy, for terminology, when we use synthetic media versus deep fakes, what's the difference, or how should we what should we be calling this?
Yeah, it's a great and essential question. I think we could spend our entire time today just talking about this. And to Ashisha's comment about taxonomy, I think we should certainly start here at the tip of the iceberg, but there are lots of pieces to the taxonomy, especially when you start considering sort of bucketing things into malicious versus creative intent. And it really comes down to intent. I think that's the key word, which of course is the hardest thing to discern, whether you're detecting fake news or fake information or proving true information. The intent of the creator or the publisher or the editor is really at the core of all of this. So, and we think of disinformation largely as intentionally misleading for deleterious purposes. We think of misinformation as sharing or unintentional misinformation. A lot of that, as Claire said, is happening in the COVID realm. They both can be serviced by deep fakes and what are sometimes referred to as cheap fakes. I think, leaving aside the FBI warning that was issued yesterday, most of what we see are cheap fakes, which would neither be categorized as synthetic media nor deep fakes. No particularly sophisticated technology was used, for example, in the infamous Nancy Pelosi cheap fake, where video of Nancy Pelosi was simply slowed down. Could have been done with any tool. Certainly no sophisticated video manipulation editing tool from Adobe was required to make that. And this is something that anybody could do with limited understanding of underlying technology. Yet it was extremely effective. The President of the United States retweeted it. It was viral before it could be contained. There's no notion of an old school newspaper retraction in a case like this. And the damage had been done. Synthetic media, takes that many steps further. And I think that the genie's out of the bottle, as we sometimes say. And it's a bit scary. So I think, the most sophisticated deep fakes and synthetic media examples will be very hard to detect or impossible to detect. So, even the FBI saying, look, using our sophisticated means, we are detecting that these things are now being used by state actors and others for very negative, manipulative purposes. You can imagine in a few years or maybe even a few months, not to be overly dark about it, that even the FBI will not be able to detect these things, let alone the intent behind them, because they will go, basically undetectable. But, in terms of the definition, deepfake, synthetic media might be, I'll give you an example from Adobe's playbook. Many interesting AI-powered features were released at last year's Adobe Max conference in October. Among them, a really interesting one called sky replacement. Something that seems, relatively straightforward and simple, which is, you take a photo of the Brooklyn Bridge. It's a little cloudy. Maybe you want to brighten up the sky. So you replace the sky with a JPEG of another sky. But what this tool does is, based on machine learning and AI, it will relight the foreground of the bridge or a person or a subject standing in the foreground based on focal length of the camera, et cetera, so that it matches the sky. Now you could cast that as editorial, you could cast it as artistic, you could cast it as true, misinformation or disinformation. This was taken at night. I turned it into day in a very convincing way. And as I said, synthetic media might take that many steps further, adding, synthetic people. All the things that are relegated to $1 million budgets in Hollywood historically are quickly becoming available to subscribers to Adobe Creative Cloud. And not to harp on Adobe, these things have been democratized already. So when I say the genie's out of the bottle when it comes to synthetics, it's quickly becoming the case that consumers of all types, regardless of budgets that can be applied, can make Hollywood quality fake imagery, fake video, eventually fake VR and other types of media that we think a lot about. And I'll say one more thing about that. The sort of Hollywood special effects studios with the $1 million budgets, their mission in life is to make sure that anything that can be imagined can be realized on film or in video. And I think that power is now or will be shortly in the hands of just about anyone who wants to use it for any purpose. And that'll bring me back to where I started, which is the matter of intent. You have technology, you have intent. When you put them together, I think you have the realm of misinformation, disinformation. And I do think that, although we say we haven't seen a lot of deep fakes yet, I think we're on the cusp of it, seeing those very sophisticated, democratized tools being used to traffic disinfo.
So there are good reasons it can exist. There are super scary, really bad reasons it can exist. And then simply the fact that it exists means that it helps liars and fraudsters who maybe a video is real, but they can say, well, that's not me. How do you know that's me? Maybe it wasn't me meeting with that person. Ashish, should we be focusing on detecting what is false, proving what is true, some combination? I know historically there's been some research on this, but talk to us about how to think about this problem in that way.
Yeah, so very, very complex problem. So, detecting what is false, I think is very hard, right? And not just technologically, which I think Andy alluded to, where AI is going right now, it will become harder and harder to detect a deep fake, right? Or misinformation, disinformation as well, because there is intent, right? It's very hard to actually figure out what the intent is. Then there is context and additional context to a particular information, which typically does not come through in the mediums that we consume the media in, right? Then there is cultural context, which we sometimes completely forget as well, right? I can tell you that Onion, which we all read as a satire, magazine, online post, uh, in different cultural contexts, may be used not as a satire, but to do real harm, right? Of what they publish. So there's so much complexity in proving what is false. More importantly, the technology is not there, and it is there, but then it becomes a cat and mouse game essentially. The actors, the technology improves. One of the technologies, and it could be a bit geeky, right? It's like the way the technology works is these are two AI algorithms competing against each other, right? And the proving false has to get every time right? One fail meaning, you cannot prove something to be false, versus proving, something which is manufacturing falsehood can fail. It does not matter, right? They have to be successful only one time, right? So that is challenging. So let's talk about the other thing, which is, can you prove something is true or authentic, right? And I think again that is challenging, but from purely technology perspective, if we don't think about what is truth, but can we actually attribute something to that piece of media or information that can help consumers to decide if it was true or false, right? Or can it help the platforms to take actions against it if they, based on that particular attribute? And that's something that Andy and Sharif and us, Microsoft, along with others, are trying to work in kind of a technology solution or a set of standards that we can talk more about. But to your question, I think both are very complex problems, right? Proving false or proving truth. But I think proving truth is somewhere I think is the right direction to go to, because proving falsehood is really, really complex.
And Sharif, in your opening, you mentioned point of capture. I'm going to throw out 3 words if you can just talk about point of capture, provenance, content attribution, which I think kind of flows from what Ashish was just recommending as well.
Yeah, happy to cover that terminology. I mean, honestly, as we saw, right, with what the previous panelists have been talking about, we talked about so many different aspects, right, where there is an impact. And fundamentally, this is all about our ability as a society and as a people, even between two people at the very least, to establish some kind of shared sense of reality, right? And that shared sense of reality is then used to inform decision making, right? To one degree or another, right? It's decision making in a business, it's decision making on who to vote for, it's decision making on who to date, right? It basically having that sense of reality is something that we rely on. And what synthetic media and deepfakes kind of threaten is it's basically an assault on the tools that we as people have, right? The eyes, the sensors that we have built into our bodies, right? The eyes, the ears, everything else to discern kind of objective reality, right? And so that's why we think kind of the provenance approach, right, may be the way to go forward here, because like Andy said, the cat is out of the bag. Like, these things are here to stay, and that's fine because they do have lots of good use cases in addition to the malicious use cases. So we just need to create an environment that we can live and tolerate, their existence. But we still have some kind of mechanism that we can fall back on when we do need to establish a shared sense of reality. And that's why we think that the provenance approach is possibly kind of a good way to go here. And what we mean by provenance is, for a piece of media, it's truly understanding where it came from, ideally from the moment that it came to be, right? So when you think about what a camera is doing, whether when you're capturing photo or a video and the associated audio, there's some kind of analog phenomenon, like it's the light, it's the sound, those things, and those things get turned into bits. If there is a way technologically that we can establish, right, how, the light, the sound came to be translated into these bits, and kind of protect that information from that point forward, so that as it moves through the internet, as it's being, let's say, resized, re-encoded, maybe it's brought into Photoshop for some editing, right? Maybe it's, multiple clips of video are stitched together to create a news story, right? Can we in fact track all of this information in a trustworthy way? Not to, give, it's not that the companies involved will say this is true or this is false. It's not that at all. It's rather, can we provide the viewer with transparent information about, this is literally everything that has happened to this light or to this sound since it was converted into bits. And then I'm going to give you this information, and then you can make your own determination, right? But at least that fact of how this came to be, where it happened, when it happened, is very powerful information that the viewer or the listener or the reader can use to evaluate whether or not it's trustworthy. So that's the concept behind provenance. It's providing transparent information, ideally from the provenance of the media, as in where it came from and how it was created, and providing that to the viewer or the reader or the listener, and they make their own determination, about that process and how this piece of media finally arrived to them. So that's what I mean by provenance. And so that's a way to authenticate information, because when we talk about the problem of authenticity, if you were, let's say, to receive a photo or video of unknown provenance today, right? There are forensic experts that will look at it, and they are highly trained, like Professor Hani Farid is kind of one of the world's preeminent experts on digital forensics. Very frequently, he's contacted by governments, by news organizations, where they send him a piece of media, and he spends a significant amount of time trying to authenticate it because of his training, right? But we can't replicate Professor Hani Farid to intercept every photo or video that is uploaded to the web and have him or his team review it. It doesn't work, right? So what we're doing instead is replacing that kind of like forensic expert-based authentication with information that we can embed into the photo or video from the point it's created. And that's the information that can be used to authenticate it later, whether it's by a person or even by a machine. So that's what we mean by provenance, and then provenance-based authentication.
Thank you. So as we evolve in this process of provenance and that becoming standard, in the meanwhile, you all have set out a rather daunting set of circumstances of where we need to be aware, right, of all the different ways that misinformation and deep fakes can cause problems. Claire, how do we scale this? And in the meanwhile, as we're on this journey toward provenance and content authentication, what are some of the tagging mechanisms and then the unintended consequences of that?
Sure. So I'm going to pretend I'm a technology platform thinking about what everyone just described to me. And I think a lot of us can agree that the surface in which people today encounter the content that Sharif was just describing and make those decisions about the world are on social media platforms. And from what we've heard, there are two layers to what a social media platform might use these signals for. We have swaths of content coming on our platform, and we need some technical signal of semantics around a post or provenance information or artifact manipulation to evaluate if a piece of content is misleading or not at scale. So can you have provenance for every piece of content that gets uploaded to YouTube, to Facebook, to Twitter? How does that intersect with their policy? Some of them intervene on that knowledge if they've decided a post is misleading, not if it's, what makes something misleading. Is it that Sharif claims to have taken the picture and he actually didn't, and we know that from provenance information, and then we make a judgment? So I think there's one step that, scaling this requires, how does a platform make sense of this information? How do they do that at scale? And then how do they maybe make a decision about that? And then there's the layer of, how do they choose to intervene on that judgment? So there's an assumption inherent in what we've been describing. And I think Ashish said something around empowering consumers to have more context about where a piece of information came from. And there's an assumption that giving people this information will actually make them better consumers of information, more emotionally skeptical. And I will say the typical default in the field lately has been to label content, that it's the platform's responsibility, it's the content provider and distributor's job to add context, whether that's a credibility label, a provenance label, let's say, if you had, in the case of what we're discussing, that this came from this person at this time, shot on this camera, or other layers of information. In the case of Twitter, we saw conveying that a post has been manipulated. And what I want to underscore here is, how do we make sense of all of this? I think there's an intuitive appeal to smacking more context onto lots of this problematic content that we see, adding labels, but scaling that is really hard. So in the instance of, for example, Twitter deciding when to deploy its manipulated media label, there was a moment this summer where if you went to Donald Trump's account, basically everything that he had shared said, this post is manipulated. Do you want to click through to it? There's an assumption that the users encountering that will actually take that message to heart. And we've done a lot of user research to kind of throw a wrench in this hypothesis that these labels may actually be the best mechanism for empowering users to make more educated decisions. And we did a whole user study where just a really disturbing and powerful anecdote where we talked to a user who said, I thought they were trying to tell me that the media was manipulating me by putting that label on it. So, understanding how people bring to bear their own biases and understanding of the information ecosystem against these labels is important. So the general thought here is, there's a hypothesis that provenance information will empower consumers. I think there's a lot of merit to that hypothesis. We also need to really make sure that we understand how users across the world, right? Because if you're going to scale this, how do different users encounter this type of content, and how can those signals be used and communicated and conveyed, both to allow platforms to arbitrate content more meaningfully, and then to convey that arbitration to the actual audience making sense of content online. So to some extent, there's this question of whose responsibility is it? Is it the end user to be a more empowered understander of this chaotic information landscape we live in? Is it the platforms? Is it government? And actually, I think there's a really fascinating question that we're trying to figure out through a big survey of, who would people want to be making these decisions and arbitrating content today? Not an answer.
No, but good questions. And to the question, I would say yes. Yes, it's a multifaceted responsibility that I think in large part starts with building awareness through conversations such as these. And I really should say at the beginning, dear audience, there is so much that we could delve into on any one of these points. And I'm feeling like I'm leaving a lot on the table, but I'm also watching that we have a 2-hour window with these magnificent experts. So we'll do as much as we can today. And we're interweaving audience questions as well through our conversation, even if it's not obvious or flagged. And obviously, this is an ongoing conversation. It continues to change and is very serious. So Michaela and Kate, to this point of whose responsibility is it? And then also, a lawyer and a journalist, you're trained to triage information and think skeptically. What can you do to help us out a little bit in this daunting problem as the provenance technology and the standards and the laws that we'll also talk more about get further adopted? But in the meanwhile, give us a little guidance, give us a little hope, please.
Sure. Well, I'm happy to start. I think, one word that's come up again and again in the last few comments is awareness, right? First, it starts with building awareness. And so, just putting out this idea that the media and content that people may be viewing, that they may receive in their corporate accounts and their personal accounts on social media platforms might not be real, right? And that they should take that into account and think about it. And I think, so that's a first step, is sort of just getting folks to not reflexively default to a position where everything that they see is viewed as real and authentic unless proved otherwise. The question then is, what do you do, right? So once you've raised awareness about the issue, then I think you need to equip people with some combination of training and tools to deal with the uncertainty, right? And I think that's part of the interesting conversation we're having here, right? We've talked about technical tools, right? And also the limits of technical tools. So there may be technical tools out there that can get you part of the way or can provide you information about the content, but how far does that get you and what are the limits? And I think, we need to go back to other indicia of authenticity, which is maybe it's not just everything that we talked about in terms of, actually what we're seeing and hearing, and does it look real, but why is this person sending it to me? Does this make sense, right? Does this make sense? Is it something I expected? How did I get it? So asking some of those questions that are maybe 1 or 2 or 3 steps beyond the media itself and beyond the labels or any of the information surrounding the content.
Picking up on something Claire said about labeling and who's labeling and does that label help a reader make a decision, I think it gets to this issue of shared reality and that being kind of the basis of the problem. People who think Twitter is a big evil corporation who's censoring voices on the right will view that label almost as an endorsement. And, will therefore, whatever is behind it, it will make it even more enticing. So labeling is only sort of a Band-Aid on a bigger problem. And I saw in one of the articles talking about this FBI warning that just went out, I saw that Director Wray is going to give a speech soon on civic education, which I think gets at trying to get at this other side of the problem, which is the user and the lack of shared reality right now in this country. And it's not just an American problem, but it's that weakness and that susceptibility and that division that allows this problem to proliferate. And whether it's civic education or, there's a lot of talk about media literacy, which I think is really important, but I even think like literature is a great way to increase people's skepticism and imagination and approach information with a lot more nuance than what is going on right now, just to sort of widen the lens a little bit. And to build off what Michaela was saying, as a journalist, sort of how you triangulate and make sure what you're hearing is true or whether a story is true. And I think they are tools that the public could definitely use as they decide, what to believe or not. Before I became a journalist, I never looked at bylines. I never paid attention to who was writing a story, and now I always do. So I think paying attention to bylines and just knowing the reporters that you trust and seeking them out. A big one is anyone else reporting it? Are you only seeing this story or this thing on one site or in one sort of media bubble? Or is it being reported more widely? Does it seem too good to be true? Like what Michaela was saying, is it sensational? Is it, does it feed right into what you want to believe? If that's the case, question it. And then a big one for journalists too is, does the source have an agenda? It doesn't mean that if your source does have an agenda, it doesn't mean what they're saying isn't true, but it's good to know what that agenda is. It can inform the way you take in what you're seeing. So those are just some of the tools that I think journalists use every day that everybody can as they navigate this information landscape.
Though I will say in the last year, there have been many occasions where I have seen or read something and said, no way is that true. and it was, and the contrary of saying that's false and it was true. So it's gotten really tricky. But Sharif, I see you have a point to jump in, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think the past year especially has shown us also the dangers of when people think that they are doing the right thing of being skeptical, but then it also goes too far. Right? So like media literacy, thinking critically about the information that you're receiving, we saw the opposite of that when it came to like the COVID, the pandemic, information about the pandemic, where complete skepticism and distrust of sources that should be trustworthy kind of comes back to, it kind of bites us, right, in a way where now you can't convince anyone of anything because everybody's so skeptical all the time. So there is this tension, right, between like, we need to teach people to be critical, to think critically and be skeptical, but also not take it all the way, because then we really are just, people are floating out there and there is no anchor, right, or no solid ground for them to land their foot and kind of, get their bearings in a way, right? And I think this is, I really don't know how to solve it. I mean, obviously I don't know how to solve it, but it really like, that's the part that I think is very challenging for us as people that are working on this problem, especially just as a technologist, right? Like there's huge kind of implications from a societal perspective and psychology perspective, but how is it that we relate to people these signals of trustworthiness while telling them to be skeptical, but not too skeptical? It's just like, I don't know how to, how we're supposed to balance that exactly.
And I'm going to pick up on that with Andy and Ashish in one moment, but right now is the magic moment where we have to read our CLE code. Elizabeth.
Yeah, I'm going to both share it on the screen and also read it out loud. So those of you who are seeking CLE credit, so course code 1, it is CCS 6403. I'll repeat that again, CCS 6403. All right, I'll hand it back to you, Judy.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So Andy, Ashish, is there a danger of becoming too skeptical? Is there a danger of welcoming the thought police into my computer screen, which I do not want and do not accept? But at the same time, this is really hard. So who's responsible, and what are your thoughts and advice to all of us as we navigate these tricky, if not treacherous waters?
Can I?
Yeah, I was raising my hand earlier to riff off of Sharif's point, which would have been much easier for me to do, but you changed it up and asked a nearly unanswerable question. No problem. No, I think it's
do that
so
and then the question, and then we'll get right to you, Ashish, next.
In terms of whose responsibility it is, I don't have the answer to that. I think that's one that this panel could struggle with for quite some time, and we will struggle with. We're not going to shy away from it. But the way that platforms might choose to exercise that judgment would be to, even the word hide is a fraught term, but to hide content from consumers. You can imagine a reality in the future where provenance data that we've been talking about is widespread, or very reliable detection technologies, which might be out of reach entirely, are widespread. Facebook or Twitter or YouTube or other platforms could, if you're in news mode and something is purporting to be news, could hide content that doesn't have those signals, to sort of at least take a rough cut at removing things that are likely to be deceptive in some way. But there are many, users of those platforms who don't want anything to do with the platforms themselves making those kinds of judgment calls. At the same time, if you jump immediately to the other extreme, which is to paper the world and consumers of social media at social media velocity with information, that may not be effective either. In fact, it may have the opposite approach, which is you're giving people too much information, given the speed at which they consume content on these platforms, much of it news. These things may just become invisible effectively because there's too much of it. But before I turn it over to Ashish, who I'm sure has the answer, I do want to point out that these kinds of techniques around disinformation, misconceptualization aren't new. I'm sure all the panelists and many of the audience members know that, but these things date back decades or hundreds of years. If I'm not mistaken, it was Joseph Stalin who coined the word disinformation, or the Russian equivalent, many years ago. I think that the key here, I talked about intent earlier. The other key here is to be clear that it's very difficult, possibly not even possible, to, at the end of the day, verify truth in what is depicted in an image or a video. So when we talk about proving things that are true, we can prove what camera was used. We can prove that Ashish was standing where he claims to have been standing and that he works for the New York Times, et cetera, et cetera. But true proof of what is being depicted is always going to be sort of emergent and contextual. There's a great example from history, a seminal photo from Robert Capa called Falling Soldier, I believe from the Spanish Civil War, which is an iconic image from an iconic photojournalist, has been questioned. It depicts a Spanish soldier ostensibly being shot at the moment that he's being killed. It served a purpose to bring lots of awareness to that situation, and frankly to Robert Capa himself. And the photo has been called into question. We know that it was taken, we know how it was developed, we know the medium and the film that was used, but whether that was a reenactment is still a matter of some question. So I think at that time, and in the times of Stalin, removing people from photographs, those were extremely sophisticated techniques from the time used to deceive people. And I think those aren't going away, but I want to point out that they're not new. What's new is the velocity at which they can be shared and consumed. And that's really the root of the problem that we now face.
So you quote Stalin, even Sun Tzu in the Art of War many centuries earlier was saying the benefits of disinformation and deception to win as part of military strategy. It's a long problem. I think part of the challenge is just how fast it's all moving right now. But Ashish, give us some guidance, please.
So a couple of thoughts there. One is I with Andy and Sharif and others have been saying, right? Like when we start thinking about countermeasures, right? I have two thoughts. One is it's a very complex problem, right? We have obviously talked for an hour about this, but we have been actually talking for years about this. It's a very complex problem. It requires multi-stakeholder as well as multimodal kind of lens to solve this. So when, media literacy, we talked about raising awareness is important. Policies, platform policies, because the scale and speed is so high, it's challenging to implement each of these right at the scale and speed. But I think collectively there could be something that we can get together with, like, if we have a consistent set of policies, as well as one thing that we are thinking is, could there be a code of conduct guiding principles across the board, right? Where we all understand the problem and have a similar kind of lens towards this problem, rather than everyone is trying to work in silos. Regulations could be important, right? But again, because there is so much good use cases of deep fakes, which I personally believe that, this is just the life cycle of any innovation, right? Initially, when innovation comes, typically the researchers, academia would try to lean on that to build on top of it. But then there are majority of that innovation is used by nefarious actors to do harm, right? So maybe we are in that phase, but the optimist in me feels that we are in that phase of innovation. And then the technology solutions. One thing that I've been actually thinking internally in Microsoft, we have been thinking as well as in external conversations is, we have this domain called cybersecurity that we have actually tried to solve this hacking and leaking and disrupting our technology, computer network solutions for last 30 years or so, right? At this point, there is so much that have went into to solve the cybersecurity domain, right? Which is, initially, security wasn't even the first principle when anyone would write software, right? Now we are at a point that, everyone who writes software actually has to make sure that security is the first principle as they start building something, right? Andy and Sharif and I from Microsoft can attest to that for sure. There is a concept where in cybersecurity, we share information with regulators, with policymakers, with platforms as well, behind the scenes, have right kind of legal frameworks to share information so that we can make each other, we can lean on each other to solve a problem. there is also a lot of investment that had went into awareness around cybersecurity, right? You see a lot of both public but private companies are actually focusing a lot on making consumers aware of what a phishing attack looks like, or what a padlock on browser may look like, right? So there's a lot of things that we have done in last 30 years or so in cybersecurity domain. I think if we start thinking about disinformation as a cognitive hacking exercise, as a cybersecurity threat, maybe there is some learning that we can take from that domain and implement here.
Great points. Thank you. So I want to talk that we may circle back to this a little more in terms of who's responsible from an individual and corporate perspective, but I do want to address, we've had some questions from the audience regarding laws and standards, which was one of the things we wanted to talk about today. And there have been both federal and state laws enacted, as well as the work of some of you on the panel in terms of creating standards to address some of these issues. And recent federal laws have focused, for example, on helping to better understand the technologies and their impact. And state laws primarily were focused on helping in the deepfake pornography context, giving the victims a cause of action. But we just had very recently the National Defense Authorization Act directing the Department of Homeland Security to access the technology used to create deepfakes to better understand or to assess that, I should say, to better understand how they're disseminated, what are the harms, and also for the Pentagon to conduct assessments on potential harms in this with regard to this technology. And there was also a law in December, the Identifying Outputs of Generative Adversarial Networks Act, which became law, and it calls for the NSF and the National Institute of Standards and Technology to support research on manipulated media. So there's been attention in Congress that we need to focus on and fund some of the work here, and the private sector has been working on this. And then in the states, for example, we have New York, California, Virginia, Maryland, Texas, all enacting state laws creating causes of action for victims of this technology. And California, I think, is one of the examples of bringing it further to also ban deepfake political videos. But okay, great. So people are waking up, they realize it's a problem, they want to regulate it, they want to address it. How about though, are we bumping into in any ways, maybe not on the research side, but other examples of the First Amendment concerns? And again, that careful balance of, hello, everybody, this is a huge problem. You guys convinced me of that when you just gave your opening introductions. But how do we find the right balance of not over regulating that then it's compromising free speech? So I'll turn to our lawyer, Michaela, but anyone who wants to weigh in on this, but we'll start with you, Michaela. How should we at least be thinking of this?
Yeah, there's a lot packed into that. And I'll be anxious to hear from Claire on this because, when you talk about the First Amendment, right, her art application comes to mind immediately, right? Using AI or deepfakes in the creation of an artistic endeavor. So there are some really interesting questions there. I also noticed, I think in the comments or the Q&A, somebody raised the possibility of privacy issues related to provenance. So, if there's a photo that's been taken, is there a privacy issue with tracing that photo or a video all the way back to its origin? And, what are those questions? So I think there are a lot of interesting issues here. You've said, how do we balance this with the First Amendment? I've been thinking about that term balance a lot lately. We hear it a lot on the cybersecurity side, right, in terms of balancing, individual rights and security. And I think, part of the conversation is moving more toward the idea of harmonizing various regimes rather than balancing. Balancing it inherently implies a trade-off, right, between one or the other, and it implies more of a zero-sum game if everything is on the scale, and if you take away from one, it necessarily, elevates the other. And I think it's what we're seeing is the thinking in this area is moving more toward harmonizing these various regimes rather than, promoting one at the expense of another. So it's really interesting. The other thing I would say is I'll be very interested to see what comes out of the DHS work related to the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act. The NDAA asked DHS to broadly look at, the technology used to create deepfakes, as you mentioned, but also at the harms, and not just at the national security harms. And so, I'll be interested to see what comes out of that in terms of all of these possible use cases, for harm, which can be at the national level, but as we've mentioned, can be at the individual or, private company or corporate level as well. So I think there's a lot to think about there. And I think the first point I would say is, instead of thinking of this as a trade-off, is there a way we can harmonize these various areas of law? But I would love to hear more from Claire about her view on the artistic angle as well.
And I think it's funny because actually I'm giving a talk later on how AI artists can be attentive to the weaponization of some of their techniques and tools and create AI art responsibly. So I think there's a need to think about the implications of that. There are copyright implications of the data sets they use. There are lots of legal components in the AI art space. But I think I like your harmonizing framework as opposed to the balancing act. So I appreciate that. And I think, to me, even in art, within art, there's satire. There are many different creative, and again, back to the point of intent, you could be creating a deep fake Tom Cruise to be whimsical, and that's considered artistic and fun. You could be an actual visual artist who's presenting in galleries to speak truth to power on the potential impact of deepfakes on women, to show something in that way. And I guess what I have felt somewhat heartened by, and I'm curious the perspective of this panel, and to Judy's point, is a lot of the deepfakes legislation has been domain specific. So it's not a blanket ban on deepfakes to begin with. It's the use case around non-consensual sexual exploitation. So it's not around the artifact and mechanism for manipulation. It's around the actual application of that. So I'm somewhat heartened by that, but the legal experts can tell me if that's the best way to craft legislation around the domain specificity as opposed to the actual technology in the first place. I also, this isn't legislation, but I think, and I'm not sure actually, within the prong of the Defense Act you mentioned, Judy, there's a lot of investment from DARPA, really meaningfully, not in just media forensics, artifact assessment, but semantic detection and assessment, to underscore this point that we want to understand the intent around an artifact. So I'm somewhat heartened also by the investment inherent in some of this legislation to do some of that differentiation, even though it's very hard not to say deepfake or not, but to say, is this a piece of content that seems like someone is trying to make a joke? Is it something that someone's creating for artistic purposes? Which, let me not oversell the ability of machines to make those evaluations right now, but I am somewhat heartened by the investment and attention in some of this legislation towards that assessment of intent or domain, as opposed to just the mechanism, which might stifle some of the artistic use cases that I described at the top of my spiel.
Andy, Ashish, Sharif, you are all working in the standards space. And is standards a way to harmonize some of these issues? And Michaela, I completely agree. A much better, I'm struggling with the tension and feeling the tension, but the solution is in the harmonization. So I prefer that framing. And certainly more optimistic. But let's talk about standards and how that fits into this medley.
Yeah, I'll go first. I mean, briefly, I don't think standards are the destination. I think standards are an absolutely essential means to have a shared understanding of how these technologies work. And in fact, it's the very thing that I think makes deepfake detection algorithms through AI very challenging. So the most well-funded institutions can develop very sophisticated AIs, anti-AIs, if you will, to detect deepfakes, but those things aren't open source. They're not based on open standards. In many respects, they can't be. They may be the business domains of the creators of those things. So you could have deepfake detection from platform A, detection from platform B, C, et cetera. You might have an open source competitor, but they're not, I'll also use the word harmonized because this is not a zero-sum game in technology. If they're not acting in harmony or they aren't the exact same thing, it's going to be very hard to detect truth, because now you've got, meta trust, if you will, where you have to decide whether you trust the thing that's telling you what to trust. And I think it's it's certainly too much to expect me as a media consumer to understand the ramifications of that. It muddles the matter. It makes it very difficult. It almost makes me want to throw up my hand, almost, and say, let the platforms decide for me, which I think in general, most of us here would probably agree is not the end game either. So I think standardization, having one way to do certain things, provenance as an example, which I'm most qualified to talk about here, legislation might help there, but these things have to be built on open standards, and the key is open. So no intellectual property, no licensable technology, but pure open standards that anybody can adopt and use. And maybe down the road, some sort of certification authorities that can say, yes, you are using the proper implementation. Your standard is compliant. Your implementation is compliant with the standard. But the things that we're all working on now in an organization called the C2PA, Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity, is fully in service of getting to the starting line, to having a standard that can be adopted, that legislators, companies, others will, we hope, choose to adopt in the coming years, to have a shared understanding of what the technologies being applied are exactly. And if you want to seek out, truth in what those technologies are, you need simply look at the open documentation or the source code itself.
Yeah, and to add on to what Andy's saying about the importance of the standardization, we are ultimately talking about media like photos, videos, and other content. I mean, these are so broadly used in every possible application, from personal, commercial, government. I mean, it's endless, right? It's photos and videos, right? And so, because they are so so broadly deployed and used, when we think about bringing technology like provenance-based authentication, right, to the internet, we really have to modify every touch point that touches a piece of content, right? From the cameras or devices that create them, to the software tools where they are edited, to the servers that where they're uploaded to and transformed, to the websites that ultimately serve them. I mean, it is literally everything in the chain has to be adapted, right, in order to adopt this technology. So having open standards is kind of, it's the grease basically that gets these gears pumping, right? It makes it possible so that we don't have these obstacles to adoption, because again, of the broadness of the adoption that would be needed in order for something meaningful to happen here. Because we understand that there is no provenance-based authentication that's broadly kind of deployed. Like obviously, like a company like ours, we actually have customers that are using the technology today for financial transactions, right? But in terms of this being a widely adopted standard on the web, on social media platforms and web browsers, whatnot, we're not there yet. We do think it is the right objective long-term, and we know that this is a 5 to 10 year journey. Like this is not something that will happen immediately, but we also think it's probably, given kind of the structural shortcomings of the detection approach, right? We really are left with no choice but to embark on this very long and arduous journey to get provenance technology widely deployed. So it will take time, but we are indeed trying to work in an open manner and make it available to everybody to implement, so that we can achieve that goal of having it widely adopted in a 5 to 10 year timeframe. We've seen this happen on the internet before, right? Like the security technologies that make us communicate safely with our bank's website, right? When you see the padlock icon in the browser, right? That wasn't always there, right? Like that was developed early in the 90s. It started being adopted and made e-commerce possible, and now it has scaled to where every website by default you get the padlock icon, and when you don't get it, you actually get the warning. So that's kind of like the change, right, in user signals, right? How things that have limited deployment up front that get the icon. Now it's the opposite way. When you don't have it, you get a warning, right? So we think this could probably be kind of a similar model. It will start, it will take time, but it will be widely deployed moving forward if it's developed in the open.
And Ashish, how long do you think this wide deployment would take? And I'm asking the question internationally, is this something, these standards and deployment, global?
Yes. Well, to your first question, how long would it take? Optimistically, 10 years. I'd say like 5 to at least 8 to 10 years. If we think about the global aspect of it, I think to that point, the global aspect is pretty important, right? Because the technology world is very, very flat, right? You can, especially with, content can be created anywhere, content can be disseminated anywhere by any tools, and the consumers could be anywhere as well, right? Especially in the disinformation arena. The example in 2016 where a bunch of kids out of a small country made millions of dollars just by spreading disinformation with no intent to do anything harm, but just to make money off it, right? Of disinformation. So this global thing is important for a couple of contexts. One is, yes, from our standards and technical solutions, but the other thing is, which is important, is the regulations itself, right? The First Amendment in the US, unique, right? You go anywhere else, there are different levels of freedom of speech, right? And freedom of expression. So that's one. The other is how enforceable would these local laws, regulations could be when the content creators are around the globe, right? And so that is something that we have to consider as well, not just technology deployment and adoption, but also how can we be realistic in terms of implementing some of the regulations that we may think may work for one country within their culture and open society principles. How would that translate into other countries and other jurisdictions?
Okay, what are your thoughts?
I have to jump in and push
Yeah.
back just a quick moment on the 10-year time horizon, because I hear you, Ashish, fully. And even in 10 years, it's not the end point, right? The technologies that are deceiving people will evolve, so will provenance and other technologies. But I just want to point out that on a slightly more hopeful note, there is some low-hanging fruit here. For example, Project Origin, which Ashish is deeply involved in, is an effort that Microsoft and BBC are leading with others, very much in harmony with the Content Authenticity Initiative that Sharif and I have been involved with. Its initial goal was to make sure that if you view a video purporting to be from the BBC in news consumption mode, that it is provably from the BBC. That doesn't require broad rollout. It doesn't require deep integration into browsers or mobile phones. Those things would help, but it's not required. If your worldview is consistent with that of the BBC, and you simply need to be verified that what you see on Twitter or Facebook or another platform did in fact originate at the BBC, that, based on our research, it goes a long way towards imbuing some trust back into the media that you're looking for. Because co-opting someone else's trust, somebody who's not the BBC pretending to be the BBC, is certainly a threat model that's extremely common that we've seen. So there is some low-hanging fruit. There are important stops along the way. And although it may be a 10-year time horizon, I like to think more optimistically that we'll see the benefits of these technologies much sooner.
So Andy, you're saying much sooner I'll be able to know if that article really came from the BBC or from Kate's friend, that it's actually that person as opposed to a co-opted byline, for example.
Yeah, that's one example. I could give many others. Crypto art is very much in the public eye right now. There's really no good way to know that you're not purchasing an NFT on a blockchain that is not, in fact, the original, might even not be from the original artist. Provenance technologies and technologies like this can help there as well. So there are some things where real finances are at stake, people's reputations are at stake, and there are things that will come online sooner. That's just one example.
Can you just make sure our friends in the audience all understand what you just said in terms of crypto art and what that is?
I cannot be sure because, to be honest with you, I'm not sure there are many people in the universe right now who fully understand what this is and its implications. But the idea is simply that in the same way that trading cards and things that have no intrinsic value. My wife is a Pez collector, for example. She purports that we have a Mickey Mouse Pez from many years ago that's worth over $1,000. So the idea that the value is in the eye of the beholder has now come over to the digital domain in the form of blockchain-based non-fungible tokens, which are things that have created scarcity. There can only be one, and if you tie it cryptographically to a work of digital art, it can retain and grow in value the same way that art can. And interestingly, the word provenance comes from the art world. It's coming back around, and when we think about digital provenance once again for art, again there are funds at stake. I think just this morning, a well-known crypto artist who goes by the name Beeple, sold through Christie's via auction a single piece of crypto art, an image, a still image, for $69 million, if I'm not mistaken, just a few hours ago. So, lest we think that crypto art is a fad, $69 million of value was transferred on the blockchain this very day. And that is another place where shorter term applications of provenance and truth can actually be effective and important.
Yeah, can I add one thing? So I agreed 100% on what Andy said. The 10-year timeline is optimistic for global adoption and implementation. The thing here is, if for a particular domain, if you can control the pipeline essentially, right, then you have a solution now, right? As Sharif was saying, if the pipeline is where you have too many touch points of different vendors, different people, then it becomes complex, right? Because you have to bring everyone together. Project Origin is a great example. Thank you, Andy, for mentioning that. The bottom line is, if you can control the experience from creation to distribution endpoint, you can achieve this with the right technologies now.
So, Kate, as we're on this journey of knowing if it's actually your byline or someone else's byline, and understanding the image authenticity, I think two questions for the awareness and the training. Given that this is a global problem and the flow of information often transcends geographic boundaries, what thoughts do you have in terms of making this awareness more scalable and addressing this problem?
In terms of in newsrooms or the consumer or the news consumer, or both?
I would say both, really.
I mean, newsrooms are obviously easier to tackle. It should become part of, baseline operating procedure in newsrooms. That this is just part of the world you're operating in as a journalist, and then what you're confronting as you go about your reporting. I think the same way the military will have to do this, the intelligence community will have to do this. Like, it's just understanding the world as we live now. And it's easier, to scale newsroom training, I think. And I think we're far from it. I don't think that this is, I think clearly, for all of us, COVID and, the January 6th attack on the Capitol has brought to light the real world danger of sort of like online disinformation, the real world harm of that, and brought it more to the forefront of everybody's imaginations. In terms of scaling it on a global level for the news consumer, I have no good answers on that. And it depends on different countries and different cultures. Even thinking about even harassment of journalists, and reading Rana's story from India, I thought about how different that kind of harassment, the costs of it are depending on the country and the culture, and your avenues for redress. Like, she took this to the police in India when she was targeted in this deep fake porn, and got very little response. And I thought about, as a female journalist in the United States, my avenue for justice is much bigger than her. And so therefore it's much more harmful in that country to operate like that and to harass journalists in that way. So it's clearly, varies across the board depending on where you're operating.
If I can, Judy, just punctuate one of the points, or some of the points that Kate was making. So in terms of training journalists or scaling the model of literacy about deepfakes and provenance interventions, I think we all have this heuristic, and potentially for good reason, but of the BBCs, the New York Times, the very big newsrooms that have technical infrastructure to be full-time attentive to some of these issues. So we work most closely with the heads of technology forecasting or engineers at some of these large journalism institutions, but less so with local newsrooms even in the US, let alone around the world, who don't have the infrastructure, bandwidth, and/or financial solvency to really be fixated on this issue. So we're actually trying, or it's not publicly announced yet, but we'll be working with a big foundation on an AI and local journalism project to try and attend to this issue, right? So there's scalability in the media platform automation aspect of this, and then there's scalability in this type of literacy and attention in local newsrooms that might be able to attend to this. And from the consumer vantage point, this isn't necessarily an answer, and I'd love to hear if Kate pushes back on it in terms of people consumption of content around the world. But the International Fact-Checking Network is an interesting vessel that's kind of culturally and geographically specific, in that there are fact checkers operating in different demographies and regions around the world who are sensitive to the news landscape and ecosystem in those regions, that might have a better ability to triage and translate and make sense of the provenance signals and communicate those to those consuming information in those local contexts. So I think there are existing networks of credibility assessment, which are imperfect. I will say that they're not perfect, but we might, rather than reinventing the wheel of trying to scale this, leverage some of those networks for, content credibility in different regions in the future.
I thought I'd just jump on that with 2 comments. One point I wanted to make was that not so much media literacy, but that there is other media. So that as the disinformation landscape broadens, there has to be, I think part and parcel of that is rebuilding the trust in sources of information that you are supposed to be able to trust. And that's sort of a whole separate problem set, but it ties into this. Consumers have to be able to think that they can trust certain news outlets again, to get trustworthy information. Holding news organizations have to hold themselves accountable, have to scrutinize themselves, have to become more transparent, I think, in order to build that trust. And sorry, I just realized my computer's going to die. I also wanted to say that a huge thing that we haven't talked about is political leadership. So even if you have these fact-checking, let me just get plugged in. There we go. All right. These fact-checking organizations, if you have a leader, a political leader who is spreading disinformation, has a giant bully pulpit like a Twitter account, it won't matter that the information has been fact-checked if the disinformation is still being spread by, a country's leader. Or, and so I'm clearly not naming names, but political leadership is such a crucial part of this. And how the platforms decide to regulate political leaders is, an experiment that's going on, right before our eyes, and we don't know how it's going to play out. But I think it's necessary to combat any of this for political leaders to agree and commit to not using these tools and weaponizing them, to retain power, to achieve power, and that there has to be an intolerance to that sort of behavior. We're not there yet.
Sharif,
Sorry
I see
about
you
my
had
computer.
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in and say, I think a lot of the conversation, rightly so, has thus far focused on, let's say, restoring trust from trustworthy, organizations and entities like, established, news outlets and things like that. One thing that I want to point out is, I think there are estimates of the number of digital images that are uploaded to the internet every year. And in 2017, it was about 1.2 trillion images. I mean, it's just a mind-blowing figure. 85% of them come from smartphones, right? So if people are having a problem, right, trusting information from supposedly trustworthy news sources, now imagine the kind of danger everybody is in, right, collectively, as we think about the 85% of the photos on the web that actually come from user-generated content just from our smartphones. And so we also need to think about, in terms of provenance technology, absolutely we should, as quickly as possible, work on those pipelines that can be controlled completely, right? In terms of, news publisher, from capture to publishing, relaying those signals to their viewers. But then longer term, we do need, in fact, to worry about those 85% of, visual media that is actually captured by everyday users and uploaded to the web. At the same time, as we build the infrastructure to do that, we have to be very, very careful that we are not inadvertently building a mass surveillance system, right? So are there ways to make sure that as we empower anybody who wants to kind of imbue the photos and videos that they're uploading out of those 1.2 trillion images, imbue them with the right signals that can provide transparency to the viewer, somebody who's going to view it downstream about where and how it came to be. We need to make sure that, as we're talking about regulations, that this system can't be leveraged by governments in various regions, even here in the United States, to create a mass surveillance system, right? Of now we have a way of knowing, the when, who, what, when, and where of how the image was taken. So if you are an activist against a regime that's committing some kind of atrocity and you capture a photo, that regime can't come back and use the system to arrest you, right? And kind of temper down, dissent with that, right? So just like, and these are the things that kind of weigh on our minds as we are trying to come up with these standards. It's like, we need to come up with an open way to enable news organizations to achieve this, also roll it out so that everybody creating content can have the ability to kind of prove, right, facts about that piece of content that they're producing to increase its believability. So imagine an activist that wants to document something and they want that thing to be believed by people, right, that are viewing the photo or video, but they also don't want state security to come and arrest them based on the fact that they created this trustworthy piece of content. And so this is, I know that there's a lot of questions in the Q&A that I saw asking about, okay, aren't we going to build a mass surveillance system? This is something that the C2PA, as we are thinking about how to build this infrastructure and this standard, are thinking very, very carefully about. So we don't inadvertently create a mass surveillance, system in order to get kind of the benefits of provenance. There is a way to kind of thread the needle, and we're trying to be very careful and deliberate, but we also want it to be out in the open so that people can tell us if there are potential misuses, right, where this can kind of come back and, backfire in a way.
Very important point. And Michaela, in your attorney hat, you had mentioned earlier about the importance of balancing privacy concerns, which was another audience question, and ensuring that the users are sufficiently empowered with the levels of transparency and choice and how we do that. So in thinking about that and moving on this path toward provenance and authentication, how do we properly harmonize some of those concerns of not becoming mass surveillance inadvertently, for example?
Yeah, I think you can take some lessons from the privacy regime and some of the strategies that have been employed there. For example, the anonymization of data, right? Somehow, so that at its origin, something is collected in one format, but then you can somehow anonymize it so that, the information follows the photo or whatever, but it doesn't necessarily track one-to-one with the underlying information. Minimization, that's another word that you hear sometimes in the data security and privacy space, which is collecting only what you need. So to the extent that you're going to use some technological tool to determine provenance or pass along information to a consumer, that you are not also collecting lots of information that you perhaps don't need to do that as well. So being very targeted and limited in how to do it, possibly anonymizing it, so there are strategies. I think Andy made a really great point before when he said that this isn't a new problem, right? That there are lessons that we can learn from some of the other statutory and legal regimes, from some of the other strategies employed in different spaces. And I think this is one area where we could look to, some of the strategies we've employed elsewhere. I mean, one issue with the privacy realm is that it itself is still being developed, right? That it is not well settled. And so, it's shifting ground a little bit there as well. So it's an interesting field to look to, but it's more developed, I think, than what we're talking about here. I'd also like to revisit a point that Ashish made, which is looking to the cybersecurity world. And, he mentioned that we've been, involved in cybersecurity issues and dealing with them for about 30 years. And are there parallels there that we can borrow and import to help us along the way here? And I think there are. I mean, if you analogize immediately to phishing emails, right? If you think back a few years, the phishing emails that came in were by and large less sophisticated, right? Perhaps there were more indicia of fraud at the time, language issues, font issues. As we've seen the detection get better, we've seen the threat sophistication increase as well. So it's this cat and mouse idea, right? As the detection of the fraud gets better, the fraudsters get better. But I think that those two ideas together, that this isn't a new problem necessarily, and that there are other fields we can look to, will give us some indications about pathways to follow or ideas to explore. Let's at least look to those areas to see what we can learn that might be helpful. Even if they don't, solve the whole problem, there are strategies that we can borrow.
I want to talk about the rules of evidence for a couple of minutes, but before we do, it's time for our next magic code for the CLE lawyers out there.
All right, so same as before, I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. So the next code, course code 2, is CCS 9765. I'll read that again. CCS 9765. All right, I'll turn it back to you, Judy.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And I have to thank Elizabeth and Sarvanos because the conversation has been so interesting that I keep forgetting that when we have to do that. So they're pinging us behind the scenes to make sure the lawyers here get their CLE credit. So thank you. So Michaela, while we're speaking about the laws for a moment, rules of evidence, do we have some in place that can help us navigate this in the court? Because, and we talk about the rules of evidence apply when you're standing in front of a jury or trying to get evidence admitted to a court, but really people should be thinking about the rules of evidence at the time of collection when things are being created, at least from an investigatory standpoint, right? And how does does law enforcement know if they're able to get credible information? And then going back to the point of much earlier, we're in such a world where who knows what to believe. Doesn't that help people to say, oh no, that's not my surveillance video, it must be fake?
Questions there. I think you're right that we may see more parallels here to like law enforcement investigations and criminal investigations in terms of chain of custody issues and verifying what's happened to a piece of evidence the whole time from when it was created or collected to when it appears in front of the fact finder, the judge or the jury. So that's something, again, if we're looking for a strategy to get comfort around, the idea that what we're seeing is real and authentic, those are the kinds of strategies that have been employed and that we can look to see if they are practical here. In terms of the evidentiary question, I think there's a really interesting choice for courts, and it will be interesting to see where this goes. Let's take a classic example of a jury trial, right? You have a jury sitting in a box, and the question is, fundamental question is, does this piece of evidence get in front of the jury, right? That's a fundamental question for the court. And I think that for some respects, and in some aspects, with respect to the rules of evidence, it's somewhat of a low bar, right? It has to be relevant. It has to be authenticated. So there are rules. 901 is one that has come up in the context of an authentication rule in the context of this debate. So the question for the court is, do we let this piece of evidence in front of the jury? And I think there are two approaches they can take, right? You can leave the rules where they are and perhaps arguably have a somewhat lower bar to get the piece of evidence in front of the jury. And then you can raise all of these questions about authentication as part of your case. And I think Sharif mentioned earlier that there's a forensic expert who's called on quite frequently to opine on matters of whether a piece of particular piece of media is authentic or not. You could see a world where a court would say, you know what, we don't know, so we're going to let it in, and then we'll bring in experts to tell the jury. One expert will say, oh, here are all the indications that this is fake, and another expert can come in and say, oh, here are all the indications it's real, and you kind of let the jury decide, right? The other approach could be, the one we've seen with respect to expert testimony, and kind of raising the bar in terms of what even gets in front of the jury. So, you can imagine a world where you would have motion practice about the authenticity of particular evidence before it's even admitted. So, instead of admitting it and letting experts fight it out in front of the jury about the authenticity, you could imagine the parties having to submit briefs to the court on the front end to demonstrate to the court that the evidence is at least sufficiently reliable that it should be let in. Right. So there are two different ways we can go. If you think about the second option, right, it's more of like the Daubert model, right, where you have to show that something is sufficiently reliable before it even gets in front of the jury. And so I think that the courts can take different approaches on that. And, we will have to see where they go. And it may depend on the particular evidence and the particular facts of the case, which way they decide, right, whether they're going to keep something out entirely or whether they feel like it is sufficiently reliable to come in and that jurors can hear from experts about authenticity and reach a reasonable conclusion about that. I'd be interested to see if any of the other panelists have a view as to, how, whether they think a jury, would be well equipped to do that, or, how a jury might listen to some of the expert testimony. I mean, Sharif, you mentioned the forensic expert. Can you imagine a world where he's in the stand in front of a jury explaining, his view of a particular piece of evidence, and there's an expert that comes in on the other side and says the opposite, right? Is that a good question for a jury, or is it something that should sit with the judge?
Or does the technology do it for us?
Yeah, well, that's the thing, is that, at that point, you've potentially provided a cover for the person that wants to cast doubt on the authenticity of the video. They have all of the air cover that they need in the world to say, sorry, AI is so sophisticated now, even the detectors are unable to tell if this thing is authentic or not. No less the human forensic expert that's sitting here, which is why I think FRE 902, right, for self-authenticating evidence, right, kind of plays into this idea of provenance-based authentication. If you can prove cryptograph mathematically, basically, right, that this is exactly what the piece of media looked like at the time that it was created. My understanding, and again, you guys are the legal scholars, so you tell me, but my understanding is that it's considered a self-authenticating piece of media, and therefore it does not actually need, forensic experts to be brought into the court to kind of debate in front of the jury, right, of whether it's authentic or not, because the proof of the authenticity is attached to the media itself. So it seems like there's some legal frameworks to sidestep this problem of the he said, she said, right, when you have two experts kind of debating in front of the jury, that maybe provides a mechanism to give juries and judges, again, better kind of solid ground to stand on. So it seems the facility is there. How long is it going to take before this comes up in court is another question.
I do. Sorry, I was just going to jump in and say, I agree with Sharif, but I also think that, we've been focused in the last hour and a half about technologies and techniques that scale. If scale is not a problem, arguably in a court of law, there are lots of interesting, fascinating techniques that can be applied. Many of them pioneered by Hani Farid, who Sharif raised earlier. So if you have time and energy and resources, I think there are lots of fruitful arguments that could be had in front of a jury, whether it's arguing about sensor noise and tying a particular image to the device it was captured on. A counter argument could be, look, this device is modern enough to be using something called computational photography, which might be in place specifically to simulate the lens or the sensor noise from the camera that you're trying to imitate. So those are things that, at least using the technology we've discussed and that are on my radar, are not possible to do at scale. But with forensics experts invested in a trial or criminal proceeding, there are many things that can be done. I think that is a debate that we'll see happening increasingly, at least for some time.
Can I just add that I think this may seem tangential, but there's a huge effort in the AI field around explainability and the idea that a lot of algorithmic assessment of high risk environments, whether that's evaluating if a piece of content is fake, making a risk assessment projection for a judge, there's a lot of actual kind of related work in the AI field about how do you go from some level of uncertainty or statistical assessment of an artifact or a decision based on data, which in essence, these artifacts are a piece of data, to a human decision? And how do you best convey the uncertainty inherent? I trust Hany Farid, but also a lot of his projections are some statistical likelihood that that artifact was manipulated. And then you have to make a decision. So there is some interesting work in the AI explainability field about how do you go from automated assessment of something that has a high risk use or high stakes impact. And there's been some interesting work a lot with judges and decision making based on automation, which I don't have a link to right now, but if people peruse the web, could easily find it.
And in some of those cases, then it may go to the weight, but not the admissibility of the evidence.
And Judy, what I would say too is we have to remember when we are, trying to think about what weight the jurors will give, that evidence, those jurors are not theoretical jurors. They're the same consumers that we were talking about before with respect to awareness and labeling. And, so it is all connected, right? You see sort of why it has to harmonize because, the jurors themselves are citizens who are out there on social media and with email and trying to navigate this world, right, on their own, in their own lives as it stands. And then, being asked to come and sit and make these determinations. So it is connected, right? Whatever you do with awareness and training in the outside world and tools, they're going to bring that with them when they come to sit on a jury. And so it's not some hypothetical pool of people. It is in fact the same pool of people who would be deciding the weight to assign that evidence that we were discussing earlier in the context of labeling and awareness.
Excellent, excellent point to bring us back to where we started. And are people too skeptical? Are people too believing? Is it yes and yes? And then put that problem that we've been talking about in the court context in the lap of a journalist where you have real-time quick reporting pressures, and how much opportunity is there for investigative reporting and discerning fact from fiction?
Yeah, it's tough. There's not, somebody said earlier, the problem is velocity. That's the problem in the newsroom. It's velocity. It's keeping up with your competitor. It's keeping up with, it's no longer, the newsrooms are no longer, the be all end all, the place where people are getting their news. So it's keeping up with, the online community. So there, I would say there isn't a lot, but what there is there's more awareness. And so I think with more awareness, you will see more investigations into this aspect. My sense is that we're at the very beginning of this, and correct me if I'm wrong, but we see, especially when it comes to deep fakes, we see it on the horizon. The cheap fakes are giving it a little taste of it, and it's already so damaged. We can see how destructive these forces are even before we get to deep fakes. So I think a lot of the thinking about how to operate when we're really swimming in it hasn't happened yet, because it's really difficult, I think, to imagine what that space will look like.
And with regard to how that space looks, Andy, going back to some of your comments earlier, are we creating a whole new class of media?
In terms of?
As we try to discern, actually a couple of things, because there's also a number of different audience questions I'm trying to work into one unfair and compound question for you all at once, but here. So as we're trying to discern misinformation and disinformation and this labeling and knowing what weight we'll give to the information, whether in court or in an article or otherwise, is the answer creating a new class of media that this has gone through Sharif's point of capture and blockchain protection? But if it's not at scale, how do we get there? And then if I can just add one more, because I'm trying to lump a lot of different things in, there's also an audience from the question from the audience about discerning fact from opinion in this context, right? So you're going to tell me verified, believe this because it's science. This is part of the question is, well, we saw this year, like what even is science? And your science may not be my science, respectfully, but how do I know what to do? Do I go out or not go out? Do I wash my FedEx box or not? But how,
yeah.
with all that, take it away.
Yeah, no, these are complex issues, and I'll do my best. I think there are two issues at the heart of this, just to clarify the problem, which I feel like I've done a lot. I feel like we haven't offered the audience enough solutions, and maybe we can end on an optimistic note shortly. But one is what is the definition of news? Because I myself relied on this idea that this is all contextual, and if you're in news mode, or if you're consuming news on Facebook or Twitter, the platforms and the consumer, him or herself, might behave in a certain way. But I think there's a big question, and we've all touched on it, which is, how do you define news right now? And the other issue is a word that I've seen us all sort of veer away from. I certainly do when we talk about content authenticity, and that is trust. I think trust is easy enough to define in the large, but once we know what news is, if something purports to be news, or I decide to consult CNN or another network, which is even a sort of anachronism these days, I hear something, I want to check it for myself. I might consult CNN because I trust CNN. That doesn't mean CNN is right. Again, this goes to the underlying depiction of truth. And I think, Sharif and I have talked a lot about objective truth. He couched it earlier as sort of a shared sense of truth. And I think the closest we can get is a shared sense. I think absolute truth is an increasingly elusive topic, but trust is a well-known concept, right? If you can sort of imbue trust into media that may or may not be trustworthy based on your worldview, that's the best we're going to do. And it may be good enough. That's the optimistic note that I want to end at. It may be good enough because at the end of the day, these are humans trusting other humans, even if there are humans who programmed an AI, which then produces content, knowing where the AI came from, explainability, as Claire said, like what it's doing and why it's making certain decisions and what it generates. These are steps along the way of one human trusting another human and their motivations. And that's an age-old, problem of humanity itself. So I don't want to wax too philosophical here, but I think understanding what news is, if such a thing even exists, and then the reputation and trustability of the individual or organization that is the purveyor of that news, those are the essential things. And I think those are all things that we need to think about and work on. And technology is not going to solve the problem of trust ultimately.
Well, I used to ride the high horse of saying, I trust fact, but what is fact? And hence the 3 minutes left. So for our other panelists, parting shots, optimistic, hope, whatever last words you have for us.
I just
Kate?
wanted to add one thing about the, what journalists are up against in terms of, will they have the time to do the provenance investigation? I think a key thing is that, getting back to velocity, is how fast does that deep fake cause a real world event, or the real world ramifications of it are taking place. And at this point, where it comes from is almost irrelevant, because it has set off a chain reaction that then a journalist is almost required to cover, whether it's a head of state dispute or something like that. The story escapes you before you're even able to kind of track down where this image came from. I'll end on that optimistic note.
Others?
I firmly believe that innovation life cycle, we are very early in that innovation life cycle where the innovation is used for weaponized to create harm, right? Eventually, there will be so many use cases of positive use cases where this innovation of synthetic media can enable people in accessibility, democratizing art, education, complex engineering can happen in mixed reality world. Once we come to terms with, hey, this is actually an innovation that has so many good use cases. I think the right kind of solution to fight weaponization of it starts coming as well. So I'm very hopeful that we are in a very early stages where most of the innovation is used for malicious purposes, but we'll see the light as humanity.
Well, any other last thoughts?
Yeah, I'll just say, and I think I joked about this panel being a microcosm of what I get to do on a daily basis with tons of stakeholders who have some interest in this issue, but I want to underscore how important it is to have all of those types of perspectives at the table when actually operationalizing some of the what responsible means, what does truth mean, how do we actually attend to user needs around the world, and ensuring that you have misinformation experts, lawyers, technologists. If you're bringing Facebook to the table, you don't just have the policymaker, you also have the AI researcher building out the mechanism for matching different instances of the same piece of content. And I think there has been a shift in the field to not see this as two ecosystems of, you know, the journalism and media space and the technology space. And we kept saying the tech isn't the solution, but I have felt reassured by the extent to which people are willing to work together, to feel like they're driving towards a similar goal, and be attentive to the complexity, but also the fact that you need all of those perspectives brought to bear to be able to actually think about this issue in any meaningful and then again operationalizable way, which is the key part. So I'll leave with that this group is all aware of this, but there are more people outside of this little Zoom webinar who are paying attention to this and doing so, harmonizing, I guess, to borrow Michaela's language again, or trying to harmonize as a chorus, to use this cheesy metaphor now, but that's really provokes optimism for me.
Great. Well, these are incredibly diverse and difficult challenges that we have that go to the core of democracy and business and our court systems and our personal lives, as this conversation has shown. And the problems are big, but having folks such as yourselves thinking about them and working on solutions, going back to Sharif's comment earlier of, oh, I'm just a technologist. Oh no, thank you, technologists. And thank you, lawyers, and thank you, journalists, and thank you, policy folks, all of you. It's a multidisciplinary challenge that we all have to live together to identify truth and share truth in a way of, thank you, Michaela, harmonizing with fundamental free speech rights and privacy concerns that transcend on a global scale. And cross borders, and keep us all on the right path for the search of truth, even if it's divergent how we see it at the end of the day. At least people are making conscious choices in that regard. So I thank you all so very much. I thank the NYU Center for Cybersecurity for hosting us today, and to the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation for helping make this kind of work possible. Wonderful panelists, thank you for your time and your thought. So much to take away from. There were questions. Yes, the recording will be available at some subsequent time for those who had asked on that. And thank you. We'll see you soon.